do some thank yous and preliminaries. Get on the thing. Leave Armond here to stand. Sorry. So first thing I wanted to do was give some thank yous. So Critical Tech Talk is relies on the involvement of all six faculties of the University of Waterloo. This means that they all gave money and they all bought into the idea that thinking critically about impact of technology is important. And so each faculty has a different speaker and we want to turn. So the arts faculty, we've already done a whole round of this. The arts faculty. So thank the arts faculty. We thank the Office of Research as well because they matched all the funds from faculty. And I'd also like to thank Lexi Orchard, who's madly working away on a computer to give me access to the questions from the virtual audience. And he's done a lot of that sort of thing to bring all of this together. And Eric Kwan as well, who helped set this up. Thank you. And Cecilia, who's working the camera back there as well. Thank you, Cecilia. It's pretty, of course, important to do a land acknowledgement. Today, we are on the unceded land of the Attawandaron, Anishinaabe, and Haudenosaunee peoples. But I'm not going to read the script that the university gives us. Instead, I want to say the question of land or land treated as terra nullius, no man's land, open land, free to take, is a thread that's going to run through our discussion tonight. Terra nullius, available for extraction. It actually suits very well to talk about technology and media today, as is the topic of people treated as subhuman, also treated as resources available for extraction to fulfill the goals of colonialism. So our discussion today is topical as we look forward to the National Day of Truth and Reconciliation, the end of the month. Now, here are our conversants for tonight. Dr. Armond Towns is an associate professor in communication and media studies at Carleton University, and he did his PhD at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. In communication, Dr. Towns' work brings together Black studies, cultural studies, and media philosophy. His book on Black media philosophy, which blew me away when I read it, and that's when I reached out to him, published in 2022 with the University of California Press, is a must-read in media philosophy, philosophy of technology, media theory, and cultural studies, I would say, among other disciplines. Dr. Towns is also the co-founder and inaugural editor of the journal Communication and Race, the newest journal of the National Communication Association. And our respondent for today, who I'll introduce now, maybe I can get him to stand. He didn't want to stand up earlier, maybe I can get him to stand up, is Tolulope Awubusuyi, or he also goes by Tolu. He's a PhD student in geography and environmental management, and I met Tolu in an English 701 critical design methods class. He sat in on it and really knew what was going on and engaged very deeply. His research, he's in geography and environmental management. His research looks at the relationship between visual culture and Blackness, primarily through photography and film, and how Black spatiality is produced in media at the narrative level. He's also interested in the philosophies and epistemologies of design practice, particularly in technology and media, which help explain why he's also an engineer working in those areas. And he works as currently working as a consultant in environmental software. Is that right? Yeah. So how we're going to do this is Armond is going to give a talk about 20 minutes, and then the three of us are going to sit up here. I'm going to try not to talk too much. I'll just keep the conversation going, and we will have a conversation. Tolu will provide some responses, and then we'll open it up to the audience in studio and virtually. Any questions? I didn't think so. Okay, without further ado, Armond Towns.
Thanks, Marcel. I also want to thank all the folks involved in the Critical Tech Talk for inviting me here today. Thanks for all of you for coming to hear the talk. I really appreciate it. My understanding of this talk is based on a brief conversation I had with Marcel and Tolu and Alexi, is that I should seek to think about the relationships between technology, engineering, and my book on Black media philosophy is likely why I was invited here today to address questions of technology and ethics. And I should note that I have no expertise in engineering. However, I think that on Black media philosophy and the new book that I've been working on will allow for some space to connect the different areas of ethics, technology, engineering, though maybe in some pretty strange ways. So I'll apologize ahead of time if this seems a little unformed, and that's largely because it's coming from a book that's not currently written, mostly in my head. So part of the problem that I'm addressing throughout on Black media philosophy, and I will continue to address in my new book, is what I would call a problem of knowledge, which is to say, where does some of the thought of the major figures in media and communication studies, specifically in the United States and Canada, where does that thought come from? To answer this question, we must go not to one place, but to multiple. Today, I'm only going to address two of those places for time's sake, or rather, I should say maybe two moments. The first moment is the moment of the German Humboldtian University of the 19th century, which would be central to the US and Canada's university systems in the 20th century. The second moment is the land-grant institution in the 19th century, which would forever change US higher education, pushing it towards science, medicine, business, and engineering. Though occurring in Germany and the United States, I argue these forms of study would become central to education throughout the Western world, including Canada. Generally, these two systems would be vital to the development of what we now broadly call the humanities, social sciences, and sciences as distinct academic entities. First, the German university, specifically building off the work of Alexander von Humboldt, is important because it would be the model of the US and Canadian university system by the end of the 19th century and into the early 20th century. The oldest university in Canada, Laval University, for example, would move slightly away from fields like theology and law into the German model by the early 20th century. The University of Toronto would anticipate the need for similar changes, breaking from its religious foundations in the 19th century. In the US, this model too can be seen in the founding statement of Johns Hopkins University's first president, Daniel Gilman, in 1876. In all cases, building off the German idealists, this represents the institutionalization of the research university, pushing higher education into a discussion of both teaching and research, especially what can be considered the scientific discovery of new knowledge. Science would not be all for people like Humboldt. Importantly for him, the university would concern itself with the development of culture, by which he meant the cultivation of a national subject. At university, according to Immanuel Kant, the production of rationality was the job of a particular group of faculty, specifically the philosophy department. This rationality, after Kant, was increasingly related to the legitimation of the nation state. When Humboldtian University crossed the pond and entered the US and Canada, the English department would be front and center in the production of national culture. Here, literature would be one central facet in the development of national culture, but not only literature. The humanities in general became increasingly central to the 19th and 20th century university's nationalist mission. This mission would not fully change until the middle of the 20th century, with the rise of Black studies, feminism, queer studies, and more. The emphasis on the humanities would be important to note also in the wake of the second moment, the US's 1862 Morrill Act, which created the land-grant institution. Such a logic may seem foreign to Canada, but its effects are far from foreign. Scholars of media and communication have often ignored the institutional and epistemological effects of this act, which arguably changed the face of Western higher education forever. After its institution, we see an increase in applied scientification and professionalization of the university level, with the introduction of agriculture, engineering, medicine, and business administration programs into North American higher education. Many of these areas of study now dominate multiple universities in Canada and the United States. Indeed, it's difficult to consider the current popularity of business schools outside of this late 19th century US-led project. This act would represent a revolutionary change in higher education, situating education as responsive to the US's growing industrial economy in particular, and the development of transnational capitalism in general. Afterwards, in the US especially, sciences, applied sciences, and professional schools become the terms from which to understand research as central to the national economy. Arguably today, you can see the importance given to these areas throughout much of higher education in the Western world. For now, I want to emphasize the considerable importance given to the humanities, applied sciences, professionalization, and social scientific research in the 18th, 19th, and 20th century at the university level. All of these forms of study would be centrally important for early media and communication studies scholarship. In other words, communication and media studies in Canada and the US, with its connections to journalism, policy studies, and the English department, has always walked a strange interdisciplinary line between the humanities, the social sciences, and the professional schools. On the one hand, as I've already noted, the humanities were central to what Immanuel Kant would call the distribution of reason throughout the faculty. It would be the place where the students from other academic disciplines learned the need for rational, liberal, capitalist democracy. Communication and media studies would likewise follow suit in many ways. There are multiple studies on the importance of liberalism in the Cold War to communication and media studies, and we can talk about those later. In Canada, media and communication studies reacting to these Cold War tensions would be highly policy, political, economic, and journalism oriented. Here, one can purportedly learn the importance of differing forms of speech in the broadest sense for democratic praxis. In other words, the discipline's concerns will boil down to the question of how do we build good nationalist citizens? We can therefore see this as a mix of both professionalism and humanities. On the other hand, the social sciences coming out of Western higher education would represent a new way to think about the human celebrated by the humanities. By social sciences, I'm thinking explicitly here of the model introduced by Auguste Comte in his 19th century positivism, in which he applied quantification to human behavior to argue that scientific law preceded many forms of human indeterminacy. In other words, human behavior that seemed indeterminate on the surface could be found scientifically. This was a break from the past. Previously, human behavior was argued to be determined by God. Now the reason for human behavior could be supposedly found scientifically outside of mythic thought. And what is today called the National Communication Association, the US-based organization, the earliest scholars pulled from three distinct social scientific disciplines in their attempt to create what they call the science of speech. These three being psychology, anthropology, and sociology, which was considered one of the founders of. As I note in my first book, it's in this context that someone like Marshall McLuhan would find it useful to turn to the social scientific frameworks, specifically psychology and anthropology, to bolster his humanistic English literature approach to media. At the height of the Cold War, this will catapult McLuhan into the sphere of public intellectual, as he would find popularity everywhere from the classrooms of New York City to the streets of Toronto to the screens of Hollywood. In my book on Black media philosophy, I don't wish to participate in the long discursive hagiography of McLuhan or to toss McLuhan to side as irrelevant. Instead, what I explicitly consider is how McLuhan's popularity, though often situated in very progressive circles such as the Yippies, cannot be understood out of influences from a very conservative variant of interdisciplinary social science. And that variant was social Darwinism. I argue throughout On Black Media Philosophy that the social Darwinist hold over psychology and anthropology would put race at the center of McLuhan's thought, even when he was not explicitly talking about race. I obviously believe that such social scientific influences exceed the work of McLuhan and can be found at the heart of media and communication studies as well, which is the focus of my next book. Now, importantly for my thinking, especially for this new book, roughly 50 years before McLuhan became famous, W.E.B. Du Bois critiqued Auguste Comte's social scientific logic in his short piece, Sociology Hesitant. While Comte's thought would be at the heart of both the German school and the US land-grant institution, Du Bois countered that disciplines like sociology and social science in general were doomed because chance actually preceded scientific law, simply meaning that humans are not scientifically predictable entities. Further, Du Bois continued, the scientific laws of sociology were not universal, but based on Euro-American experiments that put the bourgeoisie into their current position of political economic power. Those experiments most explicitly were the French and American revolutions, both central to the disregard of older power structures of the king, church, parliament, and ultimately the connection of the church, king, and parliament to institutions of knowledge like higher education. In other words, the human examined as universal under the social sciences and the humanities was a historical, political, and geographical fabrication. As everyone from Sylvia Wynter to Ronald Judy have argued, this authority of the bourgeoisie emerging out of the French and American revolutions will be at the heart of the modern university and its highly scientific, non-mythic conception of humanity and knowledge. And I would argue it would also inform multiple approaches to media and communication studies. But what Du Bois has also taught is another form of humanity is not only possible, but already exists. He argued for a theory of humanity based on the indeterminacy over scientific law, which is not the same as saying that science was not important. Instead, what he was saying was that science must be put to the use of human unpredictability for the masses, rather than the predictability of the bourgeoisie. And one of the most unpredictable figures of Euro-America for Du Bois was the Negro. Unpredictable because Euro-Americans assumed that they already knew what the Negro was. For them, the Negro was inferior and dependent on white people, specifically articulated to social Darwinist constructs of nature. They turned the behaviors of the Negro, specifically as the Negro existed in their minds, into scientific laws designed to establish the benevolence of their own universal liberal subjectivity. However, for the liberal subject of Du Bois's time and the neoliberal subject emerging around his death, the only law that mattered was free trade, which was increasingly becoming transnational or imperial, as Vladimir Lenin would argue. The goal of the capitalist subject then was circular, to promote scientific law in order to profit from its own scientific fabrications. Thus, just as it was profitable for the bourgeoisie to reduce humanity to their own mirror image, it was profitable for the Negro to be rendered inferior and dependent well into the middle of the 20th century. And though different, it remains profitable today. But again, even though Du Bois preferred to use the term Negro as a self-descriptor, he was theorizing the Negro outside of this Euro-American framework as another form of humanity. In the middle of the 20th century, Black served a somewhat similar function as Du Bois's Negro, speaking to the way that many people continue to self-identify to this day. Excuse me. By 1968, rather than continue to accept scientific and political categories of the Negro or racial logic, the word Negro falls out of favor as a wide self-descriptor and is replaced by Black, which for many signified a global revolutionary class rather than merely a racial group in the Western sense. In Canada, this would develop fully in October 1968 at the Congress of Black Writers in Montreal, which would terrify the nation as it challenged the nationalist goals of the humanities, the sciences, and the professional goals of the 19th century in its transformation of higher education. In other words, inside Du Bois's Negro of the early 20th century and Black of the mid-20th century, we can see a different form of humanity than what was accepted by Euro-America. One not obsessed with race as the way of self-identifying, but with building what Walter Rodney argued was a new proletariat, or a revolutionary class organized around fighting global forms of oppression, such as racial violence, colonization of all forms, segregation, capitalism, and much more. Today, of course, many scholars often ignore this political history of Blackness, as there are multiple redefinitions of Blackness as purely race. But the original intention of Black for a number of scholars, activists, and revolutionaries of the 1960s was to speak to a new revolutionary form of humanity. I want to think about this Blackness as a concept for thought about other forms of humanity, a concept we can trace in the thought of not just Du Bois, but many others. In Canada, for example, you can point to people like Robert Hill and the C.L.R. James Reading Group he started out of Toronto in the 1960s and 70s. For me, this is also a starting point, not merely to think about the history of media and communication studies, but the history of US and Canadian higher education as a whole. This rethinking calls for thought not wedded to the liberal subject position, which is how we got here, but the position of a new humanity, one that may not make sense under modern university frameworks. For me, we can argue that this is one explicit position of Black studies, especially at its origin in the 1960s, concerned with alternative understandings of humanity and knowledge, rather than merely a reaction to racism, that which Toni Morrison labeled as a distraction. In my next book, this turn to alternative forms of humanity and knowledge is also a Black media and communication studies turn that can tell us much about the history of not just new concepts of humanity, but modern university level knowledge. A turn that breaks from the old Humboldtian model and land-grant model of nationalistic knowledge. So thank you. I'll stop there and forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Armand. It's a lot to think about there. You're working on a very a big project.
It's going to be a decade at least.
Yeah. Okay. Tulu, we're going to put you in the hot seat right here in the middle. What do you think?
Yes, that's where you should be.
Well, here's Armand's last book, by the way, which he wants to talk about his new book. So maybe I shouldn't be showing this, but I'm kind of obsessed with his last book, and I know that Tolu has read his work too. So maybe our questions, but I hope you don't mind.
No,
we're going to ask you old questions.
I don't think they're old. I think they're connected.
I mean, it's 22, so that's not too long ago. So Tolu, you're the one who's got to talk. So you take it away.
All right. Thank you so much for that talk. It was very educating. It was pretty intense listening to that, and I really appreciated it as someone who was actually in the field of Black studies. Mm-hmm. One of the things that struck me about your talk was the idea of Black studies as a critique of knowledge production within the academy. And I think that's something that's come up a little more recently, especially in the work of Joshua Myers of Black Study. Could you speak more about that subject, the idea that Blackness itself exceeds, or Black studies exceeds the study of race all the way down to, say, forms of knowledge production?
Yeah. I mean, Josh's work is really kind of tracing, to me, this long genealogy that's been at the heart of Black studies, right? Which, you know, arguably is even older than the 1960s. But I'm dating it there because that's the kind of university pickup of Black studies. And, you know, we can even, you know, point to people like Kwame Nkrumah, who picks up a particular form of Black studies in Ghana well before Black studies in North America is established. But what I find interesting about this early discussion of Black studies is how often the thought on race is kind of a secondary thing, right? It's not to say that racism is not important or that it doesn't have an impact on people in their lives. But what to me is really kind of important is the time period that this area of study is emerging in, and that's the anti-colonial movement, that's Black Power, and all of these movements are saying Europe is over, right? We're creating something new, we're creating something different. So the question then becomes, well, what does knowledge look like? What does humanity look like at Europe's end? And I feel like that becomes a really important issue and an important concern of a lot of the Black studies scholars who were, you know, this is also the height of the Cold War, right? Who were thinking, you know, that there are other ways of living and other ways of being. And to me, that then connects a lot of the early Black studies scholars to interrogating questions of socialism and communism, and really trying to think, you know, what does it look like to push a new concept of humanity, a new concept of knowledge, a new concept of the economy, right? That doesn't exist in the current Western framework. So I feel like that's at the very start of Black studies.
Wonderful. That reminds me of so when you were talking about the ideas of like how the university produces knowledge, for example, I was thinking more, say the 18th, 19th century, the kind of ideas of taxonomy as example, the idea that you could name things by you could control things by naming them.
Right.
And maybe it's my own practice, but I do use a lot of theological education, and I kind of have that line where I go from thinking about that to the idea that that actually exists in the Bible. It's the reason God's not named in the Bible. But in your talk, you seem to make a break between the sort of religious function of the universities into from that function all the way down to, say, the idea that the universities become a way of managing the day-to-day life of, say, society, of individuals in a society.
Right.
Is that distinction as clear-cut as it seems, or is there this sort of tenuous relationship between the two?
No, I think it's extremely tenuous, and I feel like that becomes like the main point of people like Sylvia Wynter, right? Is that this kind of secularization of knowledge, right, that we locate in the kind of 19th century university. And that's not everywhere, but just as a kind of placeholder for right now. That secularization of knowledge is really just another form of myth, right? So it feels like to me there's almost in a lot of the Black studies work, there's already a kind of acceptance that that logic is a faulty kind of narrative, that these are two distinct things, right? I mean, this is, you know, people like Foucault even argue this, right? There's new myths that are introduced inside of the secular logic. And I feel like that's part of that also gets into rethinking what it means to be human, right? And rethinking what knowledge itself means. So I feel like that part of what I want to do is to say that that fabrication, that there is no myth inside of contemporary higher education, we can call it a fabrication, but it's also material, right? We're here, right? We have institutions that are built off of that logic. And there are people who make money off of that logic, right? So we have to, on the one hand, understand that connection, but also understand that it's moving a lot of people and a lot of money at the same time. So what do we do when we have that kind of dual understanding? It's my question.
Can I jump in here and be really super obvious, Mr. Obvious, because it is critical tech talk. I'm just wondering, and you do address this in your first book, Armond, this question of the human and who counts as human, for example, and the context you've just created. Now we put tech into there. We put contemporary technologies into there, and you're clicking a captcha before accessing a website that proves that you're human, for example. And I'm wondering if you maybe want to comment, or I know Tolu, you probably have things to say about this too, but how that nexus, that kind of technological nexus about who counts as human, intersects with the Sylvia Wynter-esque kind of context you've been creating here.
Yeah. In my first book, as I kind of alluded to, my central kind of jumping off point is the work of Marshall McLuhan. And McLuhan has a theoretical link to a psychologist out of British colonial Kenya, J.C. Carruthers. And Carruthers is basically building a social Darwinist theory of basically what's wrong with Africans. Right? That becomes his logic that he uses as really a mirror about how great Europe is. Right? That's the science of it is really just about look at how far they are and look at how great we are. So that framework in and of itself, to me, is inherently a part of McLuhan's logic, right? Even as McLuhan becomes picked up, I think, by the left in a lot of ways, we can't ignore that social Darwinist racialized framework is what he's building from. So if we think about it through that lens, then we have to think about it through what Sylvia Wynter calls man two, right? Which is this highly Darwinist, non-mythic assumption of what it means to be human, right? And for Wynter, that framework in and of itself can't be distinguished from race. And it's also a central driver of the contemporary logic of capitalism. Right? So how do we, and I think she has answers to that, but how do we try to break out of that logic, that dominant McLuhan-esque J.C. Carruthers logic, and create something new, right? To me, that becomes very foundational to this 1968 moment, which is in part what she's pointing to with her discussion of Man 3. I won't go through all of those terms. I hope you all pick up Sylvia Wynter and find out for yourself. But in general, to me, she's also speaking to this understanding of a new concept of humanity, which doesn't mean it can't be critiqued, but it does mean that maybe we should think about something else.
So I think thinking about Sylvia Wynter's work and say a through line to say our contemporary experience of the world, one of the things that's come up is the idea of representation, not just in media, but also in technology. The idea that how you represent things matter, and that certain groups of people who've been historically disadvantaged should have adequate representation. But in Black studies, there's this tension between the idea of sticking to representation as a goal in and of itself and moving beyond representation, which is actually some of the things you've written about in more recent papers. So could you speak to how that tension really plays out in tech as you understand it?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like for me, the question of representation, whether that's in media representations, media content or not, can too easily bleed back into a kind of liberal politics of representation, right? Which is to say that I elect you to represent me in this democratic construct. Right? And I think that we have generally seen that that construct of democracy has never actually worked, right? And I feel like that's been a kind of one of the tensions that Black Studies has found in representation. Um, is there a actual like model that will represent the interest of Black people, right? Um, to me, there becomes a general, and to me, this I think speaks to, at least in my understanding, a lot of the people that were kind of at the foundation of Black studies, like Walter Rodney, and their questioning and their critique of capitalism, right, and the kind of assumptions of a liberal democracy that was a part of that project as well, was how does this idea of representation just bleed into another kind of way to make money for people? That is never really central to improving the lives, the vast majority of lives of Black people around the world. I think that that's at the heart of Western capitalism. And the advent of new technologies is really just in and of itself a continuation of an older logic to me. So I am not very optimistic about X or Meta, if you can't tell.
Yeah, no one in tech is optimistic about X or Meta. I can say that from experience.
Are you allowed to say that?
Yeah.
Okay. All right.
So I'm trying to think through, say, ideas of representation, especially as they deal with questions of who gets to be human. And it seems to me like it's bound up in this idea of power. I don't want to sound too Foucauldian about it, even though I do look like Foucault right now, but let's not get there. But it seems that even within questions of, say, marginalized groups, there is this underlying question of power within those groups as it relates to how the as it relates to which viewpoints are eventually determined as, say, feasible or captured under the distribution of the sensible.
Mhm.
And I find that interesting that in tech, for example, when questions around diversity arise, it's usually questions that go to, say, middle to upper class Black people, say, to be fair, people like me. And we get to have this position where we stand in for people who are quite different from us in terms of economic capital, in terms of social structures and how they understand the world. And so it does seem like there is a sense of elite capture that goes on in questions of who gets to be human, and it sort of comes down to this base structure of who has the power in the particular moments. Is that something you kind of thought about in your work, or?
Yeah, I mean, for me, the question of representation always boils down to a very specific population. And even in that, let's say, representation of, let's say, lower income Black people as an example, those representations are really generally surface level, right? And what I guess I'm more interested in is what is the political and economic state of these representations for the lowest group of society, right? How is a particular representation going to benefit that group for the better? And we are, arguably living in the most devastating class warfare that we've ever seen in history, with the richest amount of people in the world and some of the poorest amount of people in the world. And I mean that globally, right? A lot of poor people here in Canada and the US They live relatively well to a lot of the world's poor population. I'm talking in a larger global sense. We are in some of the most drastic amounts of wealth differentiation that we've ever seen. And in those terms, representation is not very interesting to me. I'm not saying it's not important or somebody else can't do it or somebody else shouldn't do it. You know, if you do it, please go and do it well. I respect that. But my interest is in how do we imagine a different type of world and a different type of knowledge and a different type of system that is less exploitative and extractive than what we currently have.
I just want to go back to this issue of the global, which I think is so important in terms of thinking of poverty. I'm going to bring it back to the tech context, which is, you know, in North America, scholars are and tech pundits are up at arms because of algorithmic bias and the inability of facial recognition systems to pick up certain kinds of faces, let's say. And so this is, I mean, we still talk about this problem in terms of racial politics in North America and in the West in general. And then you have a company like, I know I pick on this all the time, but Sam Altman, CEO of OpenAI, also has this WorldCoin venture in order to feed his facial recognition and biometric platform for his cryptocurrency, went to Kenya and Indonesia and to get those faces and paid those people in cryptocurrency to fee 500,000 to create a user base for the cryptocurrency. And so when you're talking about questions of you know, what would Sylvia Wynter say about humanity and people being treated at, you know, feeding the AI to serve Sam Altman. It's a very different way of thinking about race and tech and who counts as human. And yeah, I know I'm throwing that out there, but what I want to do is try to put that back into the context, Armond, in your first book. You talk about environmental violence and physical violence going hand in hand. Again, thinking of in terms of the human, the subhuman, and so on. Have you thought about that? Because environmental violence is also a big part of tech, critical tech thinking right now. Have you thought about that in terms of contemporary technopolitics and things that are going on today?
Yeah, I mean, you know, one of the things that I argue in my first book is that in order to get this concept of the Negro, you need a colonial construct of nature as a part of the Negro. Right? This is, you know, going to like old school social contract theory and people like Charles Mills and the racial contract, and the argument that, you know, the argument of the social contract being that, you know, Western Europe was able to emerge out of a state of nature and create something called civilization, and through that write a metaphorical contract that we call rights and laws and rules of society. And people like Charles Mills say that, you know, when it comes to what he calls non-white people, they're never able to fully get out of the state of nature. There's always a little bit of nature in them, right? And that is inherently for Mills connected to a very particular scientific colonial construct of nature as a space there just for the taking, right? This is, you know, at the heart of Canadian and US colonial politics, right? The Negro becomes a fabrication inside of that logic, right? Indigenous people do too in different ways, but there's always a bit of something in them that's just a little bit more natural than everyone else. Uh, of course, our digital technologies themselves are also pulled from natural resources. We have golds and mercuries and metals all throughout our devices that we keep in our back pockets as well, right? So then there's this interrelationship between the construct of the Negro and media technology in and of itself. So in my work, I am building off of people like McLuhan to say that the Negro is itself a media. And if we accept McLuhan's logic to its full extent, um, which McLuhan would not agree with, but I'm just saying if we just read him and accept what he's saying, then that's the ultimate outcome, right? Is that this articulation between nature and its requirement to build our current devices is also connected to the Negro. And both are these particular forms of fabrication that serve political and economic interests in Western Europe.
I think I do have something to say to add to that. I think one of the questions that sort of drew me towards the PhD program was the conception I had, and was the idea of thinking through how different spaces or how different places meant different things to different people. So the idea that people on the African continent were not necessarily seen as people as much as they were seen as resources. So a very sort of pernicious example happened at the beginning of COVID with the vaccines, where you could see two Frenchmen arguing on TV that they didn't want the vaccines tested in France. And one of them said, well, why not just test it in Africa? Like, the people over there that can do it. And this was national TV in France, and everybody just, glossed over that. And it sort of got me thinking about how not just the idea of representation and the idea that the black body itself is seen as a resource, but it's also the idea of what it means to be human in some ways is tied to the ability to make meaning of the world. And I think in tech, that's kind of one of the more sort of insidious things that's not necessarily considered by engineers, is when you're making a product, you are thinking of yourself as human, and your way of thinking, your worldview is intrinsically embedded in that product. And so whatever biases you have will be inflected in that product. And if for the vast majority of us who are trained to think under Western civilization, in which certain groups of people are placed outside the structure of the human, it does make sense that whatever we make will have that same problem. Whatever we make will have that same sort of that same sort of issue at its core. A very good example is how in the environmental justice movement, we like to talk about Garrett Hardin, the tragedy of the commons. And it's this very interesting idea that, we have this sort of common resource that should be managed and all that. But when you think of Hardin's work, you realize that there was a sort of racism to his work, and the idea that certain people were worthy of being managers and other people, quote unquote people in this case, were supposed to be managed as resources. And that I just find that idea particularly troubling, in part because it's just unquestioned in most of our ways of working. And I just find that interesting.
Thank you. I think we can probably open this up to the audience for a bit. You okay with that? I'm getting questions via text. So if I take out my phone, I'm not scrolling Insta, I promise. I'm looking for questions. But we can take some questions in here first. We have to pass around a microphone. Do we have an extra mic? Do we have a volunteer to pass this microphone around? Alexa, I'm staring at you. So if you have a question, please wait for the mic and speak into the mic. If there are questions, do we have any questions? I have ringer questions. I have grad students here who they have to ask questions. So I'm hoping that, oh yeah.
Do you have to, okay. This is not under duress, I should say. It kind of occurred to me while you were talking. So I'm just wondering if you can talk a little bit about the professionalization of the university that you spoke about in terms of the land grant and the German school, and how that's, I think, reflected in the way we teach towards tech jobs and tech accomplishments. Like here at the university last year, one of my master's colleagues did a critical discourse analysis of the coding math curriculum here in Ontario and found that predominantly instrumental language was used. And that when you kind of looked at it at that angle, it looked like the point of teaching code to kids was so that kids would get jobs, which when we sat around the room and thought about it, we're like, is that what we're doing with elementary, like K-8 education? So I'm just wondering if you can talk a little more about that.
Yeah, so in the US in particular, in the post-US Civil War era, you start to see the kind of transformation of higher education into a more professionalized understanding of education. Particularly, you start to see the development of agricultural and engineering schools and how that becomes a new area of study and a new area of focus in particular. Some of those were explicitly concerned with the development of Black people inside of very manual forms of labor, right? And I think, you know, that kind of foundation shifts a little bit as we start to see the transformation of capitalism in the 20th century. And, you know, you start to see automation, especially out of, you know, the development of Fordism and various different shifts in capitalism. So the demands of higher education are changing with the demands of capitalism and the needs of capitalist development. So I think that today, a lot of those schools that are inseparable from that land grant foundation, they're not as, they're definitely pushing forward certain types of schooling, education, business being at the top of those lists. And I think those are directly related to the contemporary relations of capitalism.
Thank you for such an illuminating talk. In the conjuncture, Cold War conjuncture you were talking about with the origins of media studies and McLuhan, there's the role of social Darwinism and also the sciences of speech, in which maybe Black speech has a particularly central role, both with Africa and its diversity as a site for extraction of linguistic and anthropological evidence, and in linguistics classrooms, African American speech as this kind of ambivalent example of liberal tolerance, where we say African American speech is equally structurally complex and valid to white, but there's also this erasure. It's the same thing with a few switches flipped. And in the most recent waves of kind of media, social media, generative AI, it's so much about subjecting language and discourse to the social Darwinist market logic at a variety of levels. Really curious your thoughts on the sciences of speech as a site of delineating what the human is and what knowledge is, and if you want to, what any of, like, how that relates to the present.
Right. Yeah, out of the United States, especially, you start to see in the early 20th century the development of speech hygiene. And that was connected to what we now call the National Communication Association. And those figures were concerned with how do we, one, teach people to speak as, we could say, liberal democratic subjects. But there was also a concern with what we would call speech and hearing, a kind of medicalized understanding of speech. And those two areas split, right, at some point, largely because the rhetoric speech people made a shift in 1965 related to the National Humanities Institute and its founding, that they would go with the humanities. And the speech and hearing people can go with the medical kind of scientific domain. But at one point, they were all kind of concerned with this kind of very like cleanliness understanding of speech. That speech, not in a kind of liberal democratic sense, was almost dirty, right? And we will teach you clean speech here, right? Like that's kind of the foundation of National Communication Studies Association's understanding of speech. So in that lens, you can start to see that, well, who has dirty speech? Right? Who are the figures that don't have this kind of clean speech? It's clearly going to have some racial implications. It's going to have some gendered implications. It's going to have some sexual implications. All of that then becomes the terms of how you teach a clean speech. So when I'm thinking about this as a larger history project, which again, is going to take me at least a decade, so don't ask me when it's coming out. I'm thinking about it in terms of how this discourse of speech, science speech, speech hygiene, pulled from legitimate concerns of health, right? Hygiene movements, most specifically concerned with dirty water, come inside of human domains as almost a infection, right? Have this speech that's infecting you. So yeah, I don't know if I'm answering your question, but that's what it made me think of.
I really like this question. I think it's interesting to think of, ChatGPT in terms of speech hygiene, and to think of the kinds of training sets that go into ChatGPT and what ChatGPT is basing its construction of language on. Very important question. So yeah, I'm glad you brought that up.
Hi, thanks. I really enjoyed you mapping out the trajectory of how education is being formed from the Humboldtian onwards. And one of the things I was wondering when I was listening was, what's the role of aesthetics in this conversation? So from, Humboldt's notion of the university onwards, does it exist or appear at all as a thing within the conversation of the forming of these educational kind of spaces? And if it does, is it in the service of producing national citizens, producing a nationalistic identity? Or is it also being taken up in, say, with Black studies, the articulation of a new humanities? Is it there as well? Because I think, me and Tulu, I think, have this shared interest in the sense that aesthetics can absolutely be this flawed space of dichotomy. There's no doubt, but it's also a place of resistance. And so what's the role of that within these different sites of producing a knowledge space?
Can I ask for clarification on what you mean by aesthetics?
Yes.
Because I know that there's
great question.
100 different definitions of that.
I think mine's pretty flawed, to be honest, but the way I understand it is that it's a place and a possibility of imagining future options for the world. So a place of openness and using imagination to conceive and produce forward-thinking visions. But that's a very specific, I think, definition that I'm using.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that for the University of Humboldt, for him, the discussion of national cultures is really tied to philosophy. And really this, I guess I should say more generally, the German university is tied to philosophy and the production of that nationalist citizen. In philosophy, of course, there are multiple theorizations of aesthetics. So I definitely see there being some connection. I guess I'm curious if you mean like aesthetics in the art department or like and how that develops. Uh, that's a question that I don't know the answer to actually, but it would be interesting to think about. I do know that the humanities and the arts are intimately connected, uh, but I don't know the kind of trajectory of the development of, say, the art department. I do know that like there are what we can call different iterations of art departments that you can connect to, say, the development of the film department and its connection to things like also the German university and but yeah, I don't.
And for me, the media studies of Canada that I was trained in is one that's really tied to aesthetics and aesthetic practices as opposed to policy.
Right.
And so we see it kind of splitting in different ways in Canada. And I was curious about tracing that backwards.
Right. Okay. I see what you're saying.
Yeah, that was what I was trying to ask.
Right. Right. Yeah. No. So I think, and this is something that I'm really talking about in the book, but I think you have really kind of two. That's probably not fair, but for simplicity's sake, you have kind of two domains of this development of communication studies in Canada. And that's that policy and journalism side and the political economic side, which a lot of that comes out of the department that I'm in, Carleton, people like Vincent Mosco, who were kind of at the forefront of that political economy policy push at the start of Canadian communication. But you also have that English side, right, which is explicitly connected to McLuhan and his understanding of art and aesthetics. And I think that both of those areas kind of have a very messy friendship, right? They all kind of hang out, but they're more friends with each other than they are with other people at the university, and that's kind of a lot of what I feel in terms of Canadian communication. So I definitely see that aesthetic position that you're pointing to, and I think that both of those are strangely at home in the same department in communication in Canada explicitly.
So how do you feel about taking on a big ideas, big world question from the virtual audience?
First time I've done that in my life. Let's go.
I'm excited for this.
What are your thoughts about narratives in the media about migration, and in particular, the migration of people from African countries who are being positioned by the media agencies and politicians as, quote, invading Europe, and where the mass migration to locations in the Mediterranean is being positioned as, quote, an act of war? What sort of counter narratives, I guess that's the question, what sort of counter narratives do you envisage could be shared within the media to dilute such racist rhetoric? I told you it was a big one.
Wow.
Yeah, you understated that one. I think it's a very powerful narrative, the idea of Africans being seen as invaders, because it ties into a lot of ideas of cleanliness, and the sort of puritanical culture that exists in Western civilization more broadly, and the idea of the Black body as foreign, a virus. So I do think that it's particularly interesting because when those narratives are sort of expressed, it strikes the listeners not just as this sort of conceptual thing, but also this fundamental idea that goes against their very existence, or that goes against their very understanding of the world. And considering the sort of trajectory of Western history and the sort of problems that we have with racism, it is a quote unquote good story. So for me, the idea to the counter narrative is always again in the idea of like telling better stories, and the idea of viewing migration not just as or telling the story of migration not just as people moving from one location to another, as much as it is telling the story of migration as the sort of flowing of ideas, the sort of counter narrative that you see when we talk about the Silk Road, for example. And I think that that's important because it's also tied to the kinds of images we use in telling stories about the migration narrative. So there's this idea of when there's this thing that happens in media where you want to tell a story about migrants in some camp in Greece, and it's the worst 5 pictures you can possibly take. The the one thing you see immediately, the one thing that strikes you when looking at those pictures is the fact that there is no humanity in those pictures. It's a mass of people. And that's one way that that narrative of health is expressed. And so the counter narrative to that would be considering how the kinds of images that are produced by media, the kinds of images that are produced by even just people visiting those camps, and what does the kind of stories that those images serve.
That's great. So back to Sylvia Winter to counter Homo economicus, Homo narrans. The photos about, I know I'm going back to Sam Altman and OpenAI and all that, but the photos about Altman's WorldCoin initiative that were exposed in this huge MIT review show people obviously in very poor conditions sitting in front of a chrome, I'm not lying, you can look this up, a chrome globe. It's called the orb that is used to capture their biometric data. Those photos in themselves is kind of abject poverty and people desperate for WorldCoin tokens with this, chrome glow. Like those photos are, it's a story. It's a huge story. It's funny, we were talking this morning about story and the ability to create new language. This gets back to aesthetic being under attack with ChatGPT. I mean, language is under attack. So you think of Sylvia Winter and bell hooks and Audre Lorde saying we have to construct radical languages and new languages and so on. It's kind of under attack right now. I don't want to, start it. So I don't want to start anything here, but yeah. I'm going to read one more. Yep, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say something else about that. So when I say a good story, I don't mean it's a properly good story. I mean, it just fits into that narrative of the racist discourse that you have there. The other thing I'd also like to say is it's a bit of a joke, but I grew up in Nigeria. And one of the things that always shocked most of us was hearing stories of how many people died of malaria. Because we would turn on the TV and it's UNICEF with like this young 5-year-old boy with like flies all over him. And it's like, in Africa, so and so 5,000 people die every day of malaria. And most of us were looking around like, who's dying of malaria here? Like, it's like we used to have this joke, like whenever I left Nigeria, whenever anyone leaves Nigeria, we would say, oh, I'm going to get my UNICEF fund. And it's this idea that it's a narrative that gets, and you come over, and when I came over here, one of the things I realized was a lot of people generally seem to believe that, yeah, we died of malaria like in ridiculous numbers. And it was this particularly pernicious place. And it struck me as proof of how powerful narratives can be, how also how uncontested they can also be. It's this idea that even in the production of meaning, we don't necessarily contest the fundamental assumptions that we have about what we're doing.
Amazing, thank you. I'm going to take one more question here. I won't be able to get to everyone's virtual questions. I'm sorry, people out there, but this one in particular, I'm going to read it because it's for both of you. It feels like, but it also feels like a setup at the end. So I'll tell you what's going on here. Next question. I'm a new Black faculty member in philosophy at the University of Waterloo. I'm often asked, how do we take our Black folks, our humanity back within the academy? So many fictions and fabrications about us and the weaponizing of certain disciplines as being beyond our capabilities, even as our creations are co-opted more broadly. What are your thoughts on taking back Black humanity? Should we be taking it back? Should we be fighting for inclusion into a more universal humanity? This is where I'm being set up. Help a sister out. This person made me read that. This is the question.
Okay, so I am, I think I would say maybe kind of the opinion that our humanity is already there. I don't know if I have to, like, I think that, one of the kind of central uh, arguments of people like Frantz Fanon uh, was that uh, the the kind of trick of Europe is to kind of constantly get you into this kind of defensive mode of, you know, there's a, and this is kind of his critique of negritude as well. Um, that there's, we had a history of African kings, right? Because Europe had histories of African kings. So therefore, we are history because we can point back to these various different kingships and outline a very kind of similar trajectory of Europe. And Fanon argues that every time you do that, they flip the game, they change it into something else. And they say, that's not humanity, this is humanity, right? So there's a constant moving of the bar. So I think that for me, at least, my interest is really in theorizing what I would argue is already there, right? And I think that that thing that's already there is itself a particular form of humanity that doesn't have to be taken back. I think it just is, right? One of the people that really influenced me, his name's Ronald Judy. He has a new book called Sentient Flesh. But people never read his old book, the I'm drawing a blank on it. This forming the American canon. And he kind of has a similar argument in both books. But one of the things that he talks about is how inside of the continual attempt to prove oneself as human under European understandings of that word, we really kind of assume that there aren't already existing forms of humanity. And in doing so, we don't study enough of those existing forms of humanity. One of his examples, there's a former enslaved person who his name is Thomas Wyndham, and he argues that we deserve our freedom because he says, us is human flesh. And Judy kind of does this really beautiful analogy or like analyzation of that. And the kind of ultimate outcome is that we deserve our freedom just because. We don't have to prove to you that we're human and therefore we deserve our freedom, because inside of that proving gets back into a very kind of Western logic that I've transcended. This is a thing that I've overcome, and now you can accept me as human. But that doesn't really matter, right? We should be accepted as human just because we are human, and that is in and of itself enough. So I find like in that moment is already a particular form of humanity that I'm really interested in studying and fleshing out. And to me, that's what Black Studies is about.
Bill, do you want to add anything?
I don't know if anyone wants to hear from me again, but sure. There is the sense, and at least in my thinking, that questions about who gets to be human or having to prove your humanity sort of, as Toni Morrison said, distractions. It takes you away from the larger purpose of what it is that you're here to do. It takes you away from the larger purpose of who you have to be. And I would also add that there's this cautionary tale that happens, especially with the Black middle class and respectability politics, in the United States from the late 19th century up till, say, the middle of the 20th century, where you had this movement of the talented tenth, for example, the idea that there was this group of Black people that could prove to be on par with the quote unquote best of American culture or white American culture. And in doing so, they would lead the rest of the race to a sort of middle class, respectable status. That never happened. And the reason it never happened was the game was always changing. And there has to be a point where you have to be willing to say, it doesn't matter if someone considers me human or not. That is not my problem. I need to do the things that I am here to do. And Black Studies does provide for this, because Black Studies in itself thinks of Blackness as in excess of humanity. So it thinks of it as beyond the sort of limited conceptions of humanity. And to engage with that is to fully understand how you as a person can go through certain sort of limitations that are placed on you, but understand that the point of being Black itself is not necessarily about claiming a particular form of humanity. It's about going beyond that. So that's that.
Thank you.
I want to try and put my sister in philosophy because I'm also a new faculty member here. And I'm sure that the questions that you hear every day are the questions I hear too. I think I do agree with Dr. Towns that Black humanity is already there. And the burden of the responsibility on Black thought or Black scholarship is to theorize that humanity. But again, Tolu made another crucial point, which is they're always shifting the goal. No matter how you theorize your humanity, there's always a denial of that humanity. So I think that there's another sort of type of work that we need to do. And here we've been talking a lot about representation, and was reminded of the work of Stuart Hall, right? When Stuart Hall argues that representation is not just about representation in terms of a copy of a reality or representation as a substitute in relation to democracy. But representation can't be the kind of work that is constitutive of reality. It invents its own reality outside of the material path of a reality that you know. So I'll give you a quick example, the question that was raised about immigration. You have a lot of migrants running out of Ukraine. Well, there's a war going on. You have a lot of migrants coming from Africa. Well, there's nothing there. But you're not explaining to people that there's uranium in Gabon and France has been buying it for 99 cents, while in the world market, it's sold for $200. That's the reason why people are coming. So the burden then would fall on aesthetics. That is the use of imaginative works to deconstruct the ways in this bloody myth about absence of humanity over here works, right? So the two things would go hand in hand. It's not only to theorize our humanity, but to deconstruct the rhetorical maneuvers that make it possible for people to deny our humanity. I think that work has to be done together at the same time.
Yeah, and the point that Stuart Hall is making too, though, is that part of that work is through building hegemony, right? And through building a political bloc in and of itself that then makes that representation work for a particular political goal, right? My issue or my question is, have we built that political bloc? Has it been structured to a particular point where a particular representation, like you're pointing out, has the political weight that we need it to? I don't know. Mhm.
I think, okay, good, perfect. And the question that was being posed to me was, how do you hope to do African studies through a Black studies lens? And I'm thinking, why do I have to do Black studies? Why do I have to do African studies through Black studies? Right. So even within Black studies, we need to ask ourselves whether that collision is there. Do we recognize the common struggles that we face as Black people? Right. The policeman in New York doesn't know the difference between Tulu and someone from Jamaica and a Black guy from Australia. Right. And it seems to me that Black studies is attentive to particular regions and ignores other regions. And we need to think about that too.
To me, this has been, a central issue of what I would call very particular forms of Black studies. And I think that, you can start to see this develop explicitly in the 1970s and 1980s with the transformation of Black studies into African American studies, right? But I think that, I think there are some important people that are doing some really important work on making those connections. But I agree with you. I think that they have to be made far more explicit, right? Because I personally view the connection between Black studies and African studies, specifically in that that post-critique of area studies, which itself you can point back to Montreal in 1969 and people like John Henry Clark, who went to Montreal and critiqued the Area Studies Association, which was just a whole bunch of white people studying Africa, right? And that critique in the 60s, to me, signifies the deep connections between Black studies and African studies. But I do think I agree with you. I don't have anything further to add. I'm just.
I think Myers makes the argument through Winter that the reason we have Black studies that's primarily focused on a particular kind of Blackness sort of happens around the time that there's this question of legitimacy within the social sciences, right? The idea that, well, natural sciences can prove that they just study pure phenomena, but social sciences, because of the sort of nature of its work, there's this question of validity or this question of legitimacy, and it has to deal with that by taking on the tools of, say, natural science, statistics, and all that to prove itself as being valid enough to be in the university. The same thing happens with Black studies, where the idea of Black studies as being the global studies of Black people and beyond gets conflated into a particular kind of Blackness because Black studies moves into the academy. And so what happens is, again, we've spoken about the idea that within marginalized groups, there are people within those groups that have power. And the concerns of those people, this is what we call elite capture. The concerns of those people get put foremost. And so you do see that happening in Black studies as it becomes a part of the academy. And I think that's why when people who are interested in African studies come in, and it's like, you have to read a bunch of, like, you have to read all these people, and it's like, yeah, but that's not exactly what I'm interested in, right? And it becomes this whole sort of conflict in and of itself. But you're right, we do need to have that conversation at some point. And I think with Myers' book of Black study, it's beginning to become more and more, say, commonplace.
Thank you. I think that's probably a good place to close out because Armond said, I agree, and you said you're right. And so this is probably safe for everyone. But we can hash it out over refreshments we have some refreshments here. I hope people will stay and chat and continue the conversation, whatever conversation you want to have. Could be this one or others. And thanks again for attending Critical Tech Talk. And thank you very much to Armond Towns for coming and visiting us from Carleton and being generous with his time.
Yeah,
and
thanks for having me.
And to Tolu for taking a chance and coming up here and sitting in the hot seat. Whew. Thank you.